Imagine driving down a quiet street, the sun dipping behind the horizon, as the peaceful hum of the road surrounds you. You're just trying to get home after a long day. But in the blink of an eye, everything changes. A flashing siren pierces the air, and a police car pulls up behind you. It seems like a routine traffic stop at first, but it quickly takes a dark turn. The officer approaches your car, his gaze sharp and cold. You brace yourself for the usual questions, but what happens next will leave you questioning everything. The officer doesn't just ask for your license and registration, he accuses you of something far worse. Within minutes, you're pulled from your car and handcuffed. The feeling of injustice is overwhelming. It feels as though you're being punished for something you didn't do, all because of color of your skin. This is not just a one-off incident. It's a story that many people of color know all too well. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just about a racist cop or an unfair arrest. There's more to this story than meets the eye, something so shocking that it might completely change the way you see things. What if I told you the truth behind this arrest is far from what it seems? What if the officer's actions weren't as clear-cut as they appeared at first? What if there's a hidden layer to this story that will challenge everything we think we know about race, justice, and authority? As we dive deeper into events that unfold, you'll meet the key players involved: the driver, just an ordinary person trying to make it through the day; the officer, someone whose actions have sparked outrage; and a twist in the story that no one saw coming. But what's really at the heart of this incident? Is this another case of racial profiling? Or is there something more complicated at play, something that forces us to reconsider how we view law enforcement and the systems that govern our lives? Stay with me, because what happens next will not only shock you, it will make you question your own assumptions about right and wrong. The truth is closer than you think, but it's not what you expect. As we peel back the layers of this case, you'll realize that what seemed like a simple arrest is much more complicated than it first appeared. The real question is, can we ever truly understand what happened that day, or will we be left in the dark, unable to see the full picture? Hold on, because this story is just getting started. The shocking truth will be revealed soon, and trust me, you won't see it coming. Stay tuned for the next part of this story. You won't believe how it all unfolds. I'm glad you're sticking with me, because this story is about to take some unexpected turns, and I need you to stay sharp as we uncover what really happened that day. To fully understand what went down during that arrest, we need to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. Think about the times you've felt powerless in a situation when you knew you were in the right, but your voice couldn't seem to make it through. It's a feeling of frustration, of helplessness, where everything seems stacked against you. Now, imagine that feeling magnified, because that's exactly what happens when you're pulled over by someone in a position of authority. When you're already carrying the weight of a lifetime of unfairness, it's hard not to feel like the world is conspiring against you. This driver, who will call him simply the man, had been driving that day like any other. He had no idea that what started as a normal evening, heading home after work, would turn into an event that would shake him to his core. Like so many others, he had been pulled over before, but it never felt quite like this. This was different. He felt it in his gut. Something was off from the moment the officer's car lights started flashing in his rearview mirror. You see, for so many people of color, getting pulled over isn't just about the stop, it's about what comes after. The officer might ask you for your license and registration, but you know that there's a chance things could escalate quickly. The fear isn't irrational, it's born from years of stories, both real and shared, that demonstrate how quickly a routine traffic stop can spiral into something far more dangerous. The man's heart raced, not just from the possibility of getting a ticket, but from the fear of what could happen if things went wrong. He had seen it play out too many times. He had heard the stories of people who ended up in situations they never saw coming. As the officer approached the car, the tension in the air thickened. The man noticed the way the officer looked at him, too focused, too intense. It wasn't the casual glance you might expect from someone doing their job. This was different. There was something cold in the officer's eyes, something that made the man's skin crawl. He knew there was a chance this could go sideways, but he couldn't have predicted what would come next. The officer asked for his license and registration, his voice flat, almost robotic. The man handed over the documents, trying to remain calm. He had nothing to hide, but the interaction felt strange. It wasn't just the officer's gaze, it was the way the officer's hand hovered near his belt, like he was waiting for something. The man's mind raced, wondering if there was a reason he felt this way. Was it just his nerves, or was something more going on here? As the officer took the papers and stepped away to run the information, the man couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building up in his chest. He watched the officer's every move, trying to make sense of the situation. Was he going to get a ticket and be sent on his way? Or was this going to escalate into something far worse? The minutes felt like hours. Then, everything changed. The officer returned to the car, but this time, there was a different energy about him. The man could see it in his posture. He wasn't just standing there anymore. The officer had his hand on his radio, speaking into it, his eyes never leaving the man. The words that came out of his mouth next would flip everything the man thought he knew upside down. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his tone colder than before. The man's heart skipped a beat. Step out of the vehicle? That wasn't how traffic stops worked, right? In that moment, his mind raced, trying to piece together the reality of what was happening. He looked around, hoping to find someone who could explain this, someone who could tell him this was all a misunderstanding. But the street was empty, and the officer's hand was still on his radio, signaling for backup. Confusion set in. Why did the officer want him out of the car? What was happening? Was this about a ticket? Was this about something else entirely? The officer's voice was stern, and as he began to reach for the man's door, the unease in his stomach began to build into a full-blown panic. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this situation was. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to understand what was going on. "What's the reason?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but his mind was racing. This was beyond a simple stop. He knew it, and deep down, the officer seemed to know it too. "Step out of the vehicle now," the officer repeated, more forcefully this time. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Before the man could respond, the officer yanked open the door and pulled him out of the car. The world around him blurred. He couldn't think straight, the shock of it all flooding his mind. The officer shoved him against the car, roughly pushing his arms behind his back and cuffing him. It was happening so fast, so violently, that the man couldn't comprehend what was going on. He was being arrested. But for what? For what reason? The officer was muttering something under his breath, something about resisting arrest. The man didn't even know what that meant. He hadn't resisted anything. All he had done was ask why he was being treated like this. But his questions weren't being answered. His voice, his presence, his fear, they all seemed to blend into a silence. He was just a figure in this officer's eyes, a problem to be dealt with. But there was something deeper going on, something beyond the physical tension in the air, something that went beyond this officer's actions. The backup arrived, 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind them. The officer didn't explain anything, he just stood there, waiting for the others to step out of their cars. The man, still handcuffed, was pushed into the back of the police cruiser without any explanation. His mind couldn't process it all. What had he done wrong? Was this just a case of mistaken identity? Or was there something else at play? As the officers discussed among themselves, the man's thoughts swirled with confusion. The more he thought about the officer's behavior, the more questions popped into his head. Had the officer been waiting for an excuse to arrest him? Was there something about him that made him a target? Could it have been his appearance, the way he looked, or the car he was driving? But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something was wrong, something wasn't adding up. There was a reason the officer had acted the way he did, and it wasn't just about race. No, this was more complex. And the truth was out there. The question was, would anyone ever find it? Now, this is where things get really interesting. You might think you know where this story is going, but the twist is coming soon. The real story, what was really behind this arrest, is just beginning to surface. The truth is far more complicated than anyone could have imagined, and it's not just about one man and one officer. It's about a system, a hidden world that most people never see. But here's the catch, you have to stay tuned. You'll be shocked when the pieces start to fit together. You won't believe what happens next. The truth is closer than you think, and it's about to change everything you know about this case. As the cruiser's doors slammed shut behind him, the man felt the weight of the handcuffs pressing painfully into his wrists. His mind was a blur, a jumble of confusion and frustration. The officer's words resisting arrest kept echoing in his head. Resisting? He hadn't resisted anything. He'd been calm, cooperative, asking reasonable questions, but it was as if none of that mattered. The officer had already made up his mind about him. Why? That was the question that kept spinning, faster and faster. The backup officers stood around, their voices muffled by the closed windows, but there was no mistaking the tension between them. It was as if they were playing out a script they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He couldn't see their faces clearly, but he didn't need to. He could feel it, the unspoken bond between them. They knew each other. They trusted each other. They didn't trust him. What bothered him the most, though, was how quickly the situation had escalated. One moment, it was a routine stop, and the next, he was in the back of a cop car, his body stiff with fear and confusion. This wasn't just about him being arrested. This wasn't even about the officer's actions, it was about something far deeper, something ingrained in the way the system worked. The man had seen it before. He had heard the stories of people, of families, who had been caught in the same trap, where justice seemed to bend, not in their favor, but against them. And once you were in it, it was hard to get out. His heart pounded as he thought of what might happen next. The arrest was just the beginning, and no one was telling him anything. What was he being charged with? What did they want from him? His mind kept racing, but all he could do was sit there, helpless, the sound of the officers' voices outside a constant reminder of how alone he felt in that moment. The officer who had originally pulled him over, the one with the cold eyes, returned to the cruiser. He was calm now, in control. Too in control, as if he had everything already figured out. But what did he know that the man didn't? What was going on behind those eyes? Do you know why you're being detained? The officer asked, his tone sharp. The man shook his head, still trying to make sense of it all. I don't know. I was just driving home. Driving home, the officer repeated, his voice laced with something darker now. You really expect me to believe that? The words hit him like a slap, but they weren't the words that cut the deepest. It was the insinuation, the accusation that hovered between them, unspoken but clear. The officer didn't believe him. The officer didn't trust him. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. In that moment, the man realized something unsettling. It wasn't about what he did or didn't do. It was about the officer's perception of him. His identity. His race. And in a world where appearances often shaped reality, that was all that was needed to tip the balance. But there was more at play here than just race. Much more. The man's mind flashed to something he had overheard during the brief conversation between the officers earlier. It was a quiet exchange, almost too quick to catch, but one word stood out: protocol. What did that mean? Was there a hidden agenda? Something about the way the officer said it made the man's stomach twist. Protocol? Was there a reason they were so quick to jump into action? Was it a matter of procedure, or was something else influencing their decisions? Outside, the two backup officers were talking in low voices, casting occasional glances toward the cruiser. It wasn't clear whether they were talking about him or something else, but their body language spoke volumes. The man couldn't see what they were doing, but he could feel the eyes on him, as if he were already being judged, convicted, sentenced without any clear explanation. And then, out of nowhere, a thought hit him. What if this wasn't just about him? What if he was just a pawn in a much larger game? He remembered the news stories he'd heard about certain areas of town, about how the police had been under scrutiny for months. Corruption, misconduct, and cover-ups. It all seemed so far-fetched at first, but now the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Was he caught up in something bigger than a simple traffic stop? Was there more to this than just a racist cop taking out his frustrations on an innocent person? What if the officer's coldness wasn't personal, it was professional? What if he was doing this because someone higher up had told him to? His thoughts were interrupted as the officer finally opened the door to the cruiser and stepped inside. His face was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes that made the man's blood run cold. "I'm gonna level with you," the officer said, his voice low. "You're not going anywhere until we figure out what's going on here. We've got eyes on you. And trust me, you don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The words hit him like a punch. Eyes on him? Who? Who was watching? Why was he being treated like this? The officer seemed to be waiting for an answer, but the man was speechless, his mind racing in every direction, unable to latch on to one single thought. It was then that something clicked. Something he had been trying to ignore, trying to push to the back of his mind because it seemed too impossible. Too out of reach. But now it was clear. The officer wasn't just targeting him. He wasn't even just targeting the man for something he had or hadn't done. No, this wasn't about him at all. It was about the bigger picture. It was about a plan. A strategy. Something far more sinister than just a rogue officer with a bad attitude. There was something else going on, something that none of them had mentioned, but that was hanging in the air, suffocating him with its presence. The truth was slipping through his fingers, just out of reach, but he could feel it. And it scared him. What was he going to do when it all came crashing down? But for now, all he could do was sit there, in that cold, silent police cruiser, waiting for the next move. Waiting for something, anything, to give him the answers he so desperately needed. Outside, the officers continued to talk in hushed tones. Their voices were distant now, but the man could feel the tension mounting. Something was about to happen. Something big. And he was right in the middle of it, whether he liked it or not. The world outside seemed to disappear as his mind focused on the danger that loomed closer with every passing second. The moment of reckoning was coming. And when it hit, everything was going to change. He could feel it. He just didn't know how. But he would soon. And when he did, nothing would ever be the same again. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, as the man sat in the back of the police cruiser, the cold metal pressing against his back. His mind was spinning, a constant whirlwind of questions with no answers. What was going on? Why had they singled him out like this? He could feel the weight of something shifting, something that had been set into motion long before his car had been pulled over. The officers outside were still talking in low voices, too quiet for him to hear, but their body language told a different story. There was something urgent about the way they moved, something that made his skin crawl. They were preparing for something, and whatever it was, he was at the center of it. Every now and then, The sound of a car driving by would break the silence, but it did little to distract him from the tension building in his chest. He couldn't stop wondering what the next step would be. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. The question was, what was it really about? What was the officer's plan? What was the reason for the backup, for the heightened tension? And why had they gone so far as to arrest him when nothing had really happened? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was bigger than just a random stop. He shifted in the seat, trying to ease the discomfort of the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. His mind kept returning to the word protocol. It was too deliberate, too specific to be just a coincidence. What protocol? What was he missing? He replayed the interaction over and over in his mind, trying to find the one thing he had missed. Something about the way the officer had handled him, the way the backup had arrived with almost no warning, it all felt orchestrated. The pieces were starting to line up, but it wasn't clear what the full picture looked like yet. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that sense of dread growing. He was just a pawn in someone else's game, but who was pulling the strings? Then, just as he was beginning to lose himself in the chaos of his thoughts, the car door swung open. The officer, the one who had first approached his vehicle, stepped inside again, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp. The man's heart raced, anticipating whatever would come next. The air felt charged, as if something was about to happen, something that would either bring clarity or push him deeper into uncertainty. "We're taking you downtown," the officer said, his voice cold, like he was delivering a sentence, not a statement. "You're going to be booked, and then we'll sort this out." Booked? The word hit him like a blow to the chest. He had no idea what was going on, what they were accusing him of, but it didn't matter. He wasn't about to just sit back and let this happen. There was no way they were taking him down to the station without a fight. He couldn't let this slide. He opened his mouth to protest, to demand answers. But the officer held up his hand, silencing him before he could say a word. "Save your breath," the officer said with a sneer. "You'll get your chance to talk soon enough." As the officer slammed the door shut, the man's thoughts raced faster. Downtown? What were they really going to do to him? The idea of being booked, processed, locked away, it was terrifying. But more than that, the nagging feeling in the back of his mind intensified. What were they hiding? Why this sudden urgency to take him in? What could they possibly have on him? It didn't add up. Outside the car, the officers were moving with an almost military precision, gathering their equipment, making sure everything was in place. They didn't speak much, but their actions were loud with intent. The man could feel it, the cold weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. This wasn't a simple arrest. This wasn't just about one officer and one traffic stop. No, this was part of something far bigger, something that had been set in motion before he had even realized it. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but the moment they finally got moving, it was like time snapped back into place. The car jerked forward, and the man felt his stomach drop as they sped down the road, the lights of the city flashing by in a blur. But even as the world rushed past him, his mind was stuck in a haze of confusion and fear. He couldn't stop thinking about the backup officers, about the word protocol, and about the way the officer had looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. There was more to this arrest than he could understand, and that thought gnawed at him as they drove further into the night. As they neared the police station, the tension in the car was palpable. It wasn't just in his chest anymore, it was everywhere, filling the space between him and the officer. He could almost feel the officer's gaze on him from the rearview mirror, as if he were studying him, looking for something. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. But whatever it was, the man couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far worse. The city around them seemed quieter as they entered the station's parking lot. The sound of the tires on the asphalt was the only noise now, and it made his skin prickle with unease. The car came to a halt, and the officer stepped out first, his boots crunching against the ground. The man was still handcuffed, still trapped in this nightmare, but he was determined to get answers. He had to know why this was happening. As they walked toward the station's entrance, the man could see the doors swing open ahead of them, a couple of officers waiting for them to arrive. Their faces were hard to read, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. He could feel it building, this strange, electric pull in his chest. Something was about to happen. Something big. They stopped in front of the entrance, and the officer turned to him, his eyes locking onto the man's. "You're not going to like what happens next," the officer said, his voice low, almost a warning. The words felt like a weight pressing down on the man's chest. What could they possibly be preparing for? What were they about to do? His mind spun, and for a moment, he almost didn't want to know the answer. The anticipation was killing him, the tension unbearable. He couldn't escape it. Something was going to break, he could feel it. But what? Just as they reached the door, a loud, sharp sound echoed through the air, like a siren in the distance. The officers froze, all of them instinctively looking toward the source of the noise. Something was happening. Something outside of their control. The man's heart raced faster. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything changed? The officers exchanged quick glances, and the man's mind went into overdrive. Whatever was coming, it was big. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but the truth was still just out of reach, lingering like a shadow on the edge of his understanding. He had no idea what would happen next. But whatever it was about to rock everything he thought he knew to its core. And the climax was coming. It was so close. The siren's wail grew louder, echoing through the cold air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers stood motionless, their eyes flicking from one another to the man, as if waiting for something they hadn't expected. The man could feel the tension shift in the air. It was no longer just about his arrest. Something else was happening, something bigger than him, and his gut told him that whatever it was coming for all of them. The officers exchanged quick, sharp glances. One of them, the younger of the two, moved toward the entrance, his hand hovering near his radio, uncertainty written all over his face. The older officer, still the one who had initiated the arrest, was stone-faced, like he knew exactly what was going on. But his expression betrayed something else, something darker. He had expected the noise, and now that it was here, he didn't look relieved. He looked worried. The man's heart pounded in his chest, the sharp sound of the siren cutting through the silence around them. Something about the urgency in the officer's movements made it clear that this wasn't just a random disturbance. Whatever was about to unfold was connected to the situation they had created with him. The arrest. The strange protocols. The backup. Everything was starting to converge. "Stay here," the older officer ordered, turning on his heel and heading toward the door. He didn't look back, but the force of his command echoed in the man's ears, locking him in place. The younger officer followed him, hesitating only for a brief moment, before the door swung shut behind them. For the man left standing there, time slowed down. The siren wasn't getting any quieter. It seemed to be growing closer, louder, more insistent. And for the first time since the stop, he realized how much he didn't know. What had triggered this alarm? What had he unknowingly stumbled into? The officer's behavior, so rehearsed, so calculated, suddenly seemed less like an arrest and more like a small piece in a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that was rapidly shifting, pieces falling into place around him without his control. As he strained his ears to hear anything beyond the sirens, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the older officer returning. It was someone else, a figure dressed in black, a tactical uniform, their face hidden behind a mask. The new arrival moved quickly, efficiently, not bothering to acknowledge the man in the cruiser. His focus was solely on the two officers, who had gathered near the entrance, looking tense. There was a hushed exchange, and then the masked figure gestured toward the man, who was still in the back of the police car. It wasn't an order, it was a signal. The older officer's shoulders stiffened, and the younger officer's hand instinctively went to his holster. But the masked figure said nothing more. Instead, he turned abruptly, heading toward the station's back entrance, and the officers followed. The man couldn't see where they were going or what they were planning, but he could feel the shift in the air. Everything was different now. As they walked away, the man sat there, his mind racing. This wasn't just an arrest. This wasn't about a routine traffic stop, or even about the officer's prejudices. This was something far more complex, more dangerous. The siren's wail was still in the background, but it felt like it was echoing from a different world, one where nothing was as it seemed. Every instinct in his body told him to stay alert, to stay quiet. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling that whatever came next was going to change everything. He watched the officers disappear into the station, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Was this just some kind of police exercise? Some training? Or was there something more at play, something they were trying to hide? Why had they arrested him in the first place? Was it because of his race? Was it personal? Or had he unknowingly gotten involved in something far beyond his understanding? He didn't know how long he sat there, but it felt like hours. His mind kept turning, each thought more frantic than the last. The air inside the car was thick, oppressive. And then, out of nowhere, the doors swung open again. The officer, the same one who had arrested him, reappeared, but this time, his expression was different. Gone was the cold, detached look. Now, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, something the man couldn't quite place. It was almost as if the officer had seen something that had shaken him, something that had completely changed his perspective. He stood there for a moment, just looking at the man, before closing the door behind him with a finality that made the man's stomach tighten. "What's going on?" the man asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder toward the station's entrance, making sure no one was watching, before leaning in closer. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're not who they think you are." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer hesitated, glancing once more toward the entrance. Then, without another word, he slid into the car beside him. The man could feel the heat of the officer's body close to his, the air thick with tension. "Listen," the officer said urgently, "you were never supposed to be here. This whole thing, it's a setup. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. I don't know all the details, but I know enough to tell you that you need to get out of here. Now." The man's pulse quickened. His mind raced to make sense of the officer's words. A setup? What was he saying? Who was behind this? "Who's behind this?" the man asked, his voice rising with panic. "What's going on?" The officer's eyes darted toward the door again, and then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The people you think are your allies? They're not. And the ones you think are against you? They're just doing their job. But none of this is what you think it is. And if you don't leave now, it's over." The man's head spun. The officer's words, cryptic as they were, only added to the confusion. What had he stumbled into? Who was pulling the strings? And what was the officer so afraid of? Before he could ask another question, the officer reached for the door handle, glancing back at him with a look of urgency. "Get out of here," he said, pushing the door open and quickly stepping out. Now. You don't have much time. The man was left in the cruiser, stunned, his heart racing. Every instinct in his body told him to follow the officer's advice, to get out while he still had a chance. But the weight of his confusion kept him rooted to the spot. What had just happened? And why did it feel like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into something he could never get out of? And then, as the sirens grew louder once again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching echoed in the distance, and he realized whatever was coming next, it was too late to run. The man sat there for a moment, heart pounding, unable to move. The officer's warning rang in his ears, and for a second, it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to that one breathless moment. Should he follow the officer's advice and escape? Should he run, leave this all behind? Or was he already too deep, tangled in a web of lies and confusion he couldn't unravel on his own? His mind raced as the sound of footsteps grew louder. It was too late to make a clean break. The decision had been made for him, there was no escaping now. The door to the cruiser swung open again, and this time, it wasn't the officer returning. The figure that stepped in was tall, dressed in black, their face obscured by a tactical mask. The man barely had time to process the figure's presence before a sharp voice cut through the silence. Get out. Now. The command wasn't an offer, it was an order, and it left no room for disobedience. For a moment, the man's body didn't respond. His mind was still reeling from the officer's cryptic warning, unsure of who he could trust. But the figure in front of him wasn't waiting for a decision. Before he could even blink, the masked figure yanked him from the seat and shoved him toward the back of the station. The cold night air bit into his skin, and the sound of the sirens, still blaring in the distance, made everything feel like it was happening in slow motion. As they reached the station's rear entrance, the man was shoved through the door, into a dimly lit hallway. The figure didn't speak, only moved with a calculated precision, dragging him forward. His mind was racing. Who were these people? What did they want with him? And why was he suddenly the center of something so much bigger than a simple traffic stop? The questions piled on top of each other, each one more urgent than the last. They stopped in front of a heavy door. The figure knocked twice, and a low voice responded from inside. Is he here? The masked figure nodded, then turned to the man. Stay quiet, they warned, before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was stark, filled with monitors and old files scattered across the desks. The walls were bare except for a few maps pinned up here and there, their meaning lost on him. At first, the man didn't recognize anyone, but then a man sitting at the far desk stood up. His presence was commanding, his gaze sharp, like he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. You've made it this far, but it's not over, the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. You're not going anywhere, and neither is the truth. The man's chest tightened. Who are you? What do you want with me? The figure smirked, pacing slowly around the room. It's simple. You were never meant to get this far. You weren't supposed to even ask questions. But here we are. Before the man could respond, the door slammed open again, and the younger officer from earlier stormed into the room, visibly agitated. His eyes darted between the man and the figure at the desk, and the tension in the air spiked. He shouldn't have come here, the officer spat, his hands clenched at his sides. This was a mistake. Not anymore, the man at the desk said calmly. It's too late for him. He's already involved. He turned to the man in the chair, his gaze piercing. You think you're innocent, don't you? That you just got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that's not the case. You're a part of something much bigger. Something you don't even realize. The man shook his head, his mind spinning. What do you mean? What's going on here? Your name your whole life was never just your own. You've been under surveillance for months. Years even. But not because of anything you've done. No, the man at the desk continued, his voice laced with quiet menace. Because you're connected to someone who is. Someone powerful. Someone who is tied to everything. And now that connection has brought you right into the middle of this. The man's thoughts scrambled to make sense of what he was hearing. The officer who had arrested him, the cryptic warning, the strange behavior of everyone involved, it was all beginning to fall into place. But there was still one piece he couldn't understand. Who's behind this? He demanded, his voice shaking. Who's pulling the strings? Who's watching me? The man at the desk took a step closer, lowering his voice as if revealing a dark secret. It's not who's watching you, it's who you're connected to. Someone in your life. Someone you trust. He leaned in, locking eyes with him. Someone you would never suspect. A chill ran down the man's spine. He turned to the younger officer, the one who had been there from the beginning. But the officer was staring at the ground, not meeting his eyes. The realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just a random arrest. This wasn't just about him at all. The officer had been part of it from the start, playing his role in a much bigger scheme. He wasn't just a cop caught in the middle, he was an actor in a plan far beyond anything the man could have imagined. The man took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. He had been manipulated into playing a part in this game, a game where the stakes were higher than his freedom. A game where the truth was just out of reach, and the consequences of knowing too much were far greater than he could comprehend. "What do you want from me?" the man whispered, the fear creeping into his voice. The man at the desk smiled, the kind of smile that sent shivers down his spine. "It's not about what we want from you. It's about what you can give us. You've been a pawn in a much larger operation, and now we need you to finish what you started." The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing inward, suffocating. He had no idea what was going to happen next. He couldn't escape this, he was too deep, too involved. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, to plead, the lights in the room flickered, and the sound of a door slamming open echoed in the hall. The masked figure, the one who had pulled him into this mess, stood at the entrance with a gun in hand. "Get down!" the figure shouted. Everything exploded into chaos. The man at the desk cursed, diving behind the desk, and the younger officer moved to shield him. In the chaos, the masked figure fired a shot, and the man ducked instinctively, feeling the heat of the bullet pass by his ear. He had no idea who the masked figure was targeting, or who was on his side. All he knew was that this was far from over. Whatever was happening, whatever game they were playing, it was far from finished. And in that moment, as the room descended into madness, one question lingered in his mind: had he just walked into the final act of a play, or was this just the beginning of the end? The sound of gunfire echoed in the cramped room, leaving everything in a blur of confusion. The man dropped to the floor, heart pounding, his breath shallow as the chaos unfolded around him. The masked figure with the gun shouted again, moving swiftly toward the center of the room, where the officer and the man at the desk crouched behind a set of metal cabinets. The man could hear footsteps running, fast, the sound of people scrambling, unsure of where to go, but all clearly desperate. His head was spinning, thoughts colliding in his mind. Who was shooting? Was this a rescue, or an attack? He tried to stay low, pressing himself against the cold floor, hoping to stay out of the line of fire. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, but at the same time, it was all too fast, too sudden. There were shouts, more gunshots, and the sound of shuffling, as if everyone was running toward the same, but unclear, destination. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of it all. He had walked into something far beyond anything he had imagined. A fight for power. A battle between unknown forces. He was just an unwilling player, and now he wasn't sure if he would make it out alive. The masked figure was shouting, but the words didn't register. His voice was lost in the confusion of the room. The man tried to keep his head down, afraid of drawing attention to himself. In the midst of all this, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the officer who had warned him. Was he okay? What about the people behind all this? Was he in danger, or were they all targets of something even bigger? Had it been a setup from the start? And then, as the shouts grew louder and the gunfire continued, there was a sharp click, and everything came to an abrupt stop. The room froze, as if everyone had collectively realized something. The figure with the gun lowered it slowly, his breathing heavy in the stillness. The man couldn't move. He didn't know if he was in danger or if he had somehow survived the worst of it. He didn't know what would happen next. "You can come out now," a voice called from the shadows. It wasn't the masked figure, but the same voice from before, the one that had spoken from behind the desk. "It's over. For now." The man hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was a trap. But there was a sense of finality in the air. The gunshots had stopped. The noise had quieted. It was almost as if a different phase of the chaos had begun, one that didn't involve him being in the crossfire. He stood cautiously, his legs shaking as he adjusted to the sudden silence. The room was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, chairs knocked over, and the faint smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. His pulse was still racing, but something in the tone of the voice seemed to assure him that, for now, he was safe. As he slowly rose to his feet, he caught a glimpse of the officer, the same one who had arrested him at the start. The officer's face was bruised, his uniform torn, but there was a strange look in his eyes, as if he had been through something just as complicated as the man had. He didn't speak, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now, an understanding that they had both been pawns in a game much larger than either of them could have realized. The man turned to the voice behind the desk, still cautious. The figure who had been orchestrating this whole mess was now standing in the open, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. He didn't have a weapon, but his presence was no less intimidating. He was tall, well-built, with sharp eyes that seemed to analyze every movement. His demeanor was calculated, controlled, but the warmth in his gaze suggested that, for whatever reason, he was done fighting. "It's over," the man at the desk repeated. "For now." The younger officer was still standing at the far side of the room, his eyes downcast, his fists clenched at his sides. He hadn't moved since the gunfire had stopped. It was clear that he was shaken, still processing the intensity of the events that had just unfolded. "You're not going anywhere," the man at the desk continued, breaking the silence. "But we need to talk. You're involved now, and there's no going back." The man took a deep breath. He had no idea what they meant by that, or what their plan was. All he knew was that everything had shifted. The reality he thought he understood, police officers, law, order, had been shattered. He was trapped in something much bigger now, something far more complicated. The officer who had arrested him earlier spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this. None of us did. But we were forced into it. You were never supposed to get this far." "What do you mean?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. His mind was still trying to piece everything together. "What's going on? What am I really involved in?" The man behind the desk took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "This whole situation, it's part of a larger investigation. An operation that goes deep. It involves people you wouldn't expect. Powerful people. People in positions that make them untouchable. But you were the key. We used you, got you involved because we knew that the people we're up against wouldn't expect it." The officer who had been so visibly shaken before now spoke again. "I didn't have a choice. None of us did. They made sure of it. I'm sorry." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the man felt his chest tighten. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. The arrest, the mysterious forces at play, the warnings, it was all part of something so much bigger than a simple traffic stop. It was a web of manipulation, power, and control. "You've been a pawn," the man at the desk said. "But now, you're the only one who can help us bring this down. You're the one who can expose the truth." The words hung heavy in the air. The man felt a strange mix of disbelief and anger. How had he gotten tangled in something like this? Why had he been used in such a dangerous game? But the man at the desk wasn't done. "You need to understand, we're not the bad guys here. We're trying to do what's right. We've been working undercover, gathering evidence to take down those who are really pulling the strings. But we can't do it alone. We need someone like you, someone who's close enough to the situation, someone they'll never see coming." The man's thoughts swirled. It was too much to take in all at once. But something inside him clicked. He had a choice. He could keep his head down, walk away, and leave it all behind. But he knew deep down that this wasn't just about him anymore. He wasn't going to be a pawn any longer. He would make a stand. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of his emotions. The officer who had arrested him nodded, his expression full of gratitude. "We're going to need everything you've got. It's not going to be easy, but if we work together, we can make sure they pay for what they've done." The man took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer a victim in someone else's game. He would fight back. He would make them pay for everything they'd done to him and to everyone else who had been caught in this web of lies. As the officers began to regroup, preparing for what would come next, the man felt something stirring deep within him. A resolve. A sense of purpose. And although the road ahead would be long and dangerous, he knew he was ready to face whatever was coming next. The game had changed, and he was no longer playing by their rules. He was making his own. And with that, the door to his future swung open. The man stepped forward, ready for the battle ahead. Whatever it took, he would fight for the truth.